All right, let's dive right into this explainer and unpack a dense, ancient text to see how it urgently reflects our modern society, our politics, and honestly, our own moral compass. We're looking at Plato's Republic, which is easily one of the most foundational works of political philosophy ever written. Now, it's really easy to think of ancient texts as just dusty relics, but the arguments happening in this dialogue, they're the exact same arguments we're having today about power, loyalty, and what it actually means to be a good person. So here's our roadmap. We are going to logically dismantle some common views of justice by looking at loyalty versus true justice, justice as raw power, the ring of Gyges, the city and the soul, and finally, taming the feverish city. Let's kick things off with part one, loyalty versus true justice. We start with a remarkably relatable problem brought up by a guy named Polemarchus. Now, Polemarchus is what the Greeks would consider a true gentleman. He's the kind of guy who will fiercely, absolutely stand up for his inner circle. He holds a definition of justice you'll probably recognize. He views it as a kind of unreflective loyalty or patriotism. Think about that fierce devotion you might feel for your family, your country, or, even your favorite sports team. For him, justice simply means giving to each what is owed, which translates to helping your friends and harming your enemies. It's a very basic us versus them mentality, where justice is just blind devotion to your own tribe. Sounds a bit like common sense, right? Well, Socrates completely trips him up using his famous Socratic method. He asks a beautifully simple question. Hey, do we ever make mistakes? Haven't we all thought someone was our loyal friend only to find out they were actively talking behind our backs? If we can't reliably know who our true friends and true enemies actually are, how on earth can justice be based on helping one and harming the other? This brilliantly illustrates that without reflection, blind loyalty to our tribe is basically guaranteed to result in terrible injustice to others. Socrates dissolves those comfortable bonds of familiarity right there. He's showing us that unreflective patriotism just isn't enough. True justice requires deep knowledge. You have to be able to accurately distinguish good from bad, rather than just blindly defending whoever happens to be wearing your team's jersey. Which brings us right into section 2, justice as raw power. With loyalty totally dissolved, we meet a much tougher challenger. Enter Thrasymachus. He's essentially the Dr. Moriarty to Socrates' Sherlock Holmes, a hard-boiled realist who just wants to shatter all our pretty illusions. He drops this cynical bombshell that society is really just a zero-sum game, and justice is nothing more than the interest of the stronger. Thrasymachus is that intellectual who loves telling you there's no Santa Claus. He looks at society and says, look, the rules are simply made by the winners to benefit themselves. To him, obeying the law is literally a sucker's game played by the weak. Thrasymachus assumes we are all just alpha males, driven entirely by domination. But Socrates points out a massive, fatal flaw in this cynical logic. He asks again, wait, do rulers ever make mistakes? Thrasymachus is forced to admit that, well, yeah, sometimes rulers make laws that accidentally hurt their own interests. So the crucial takeaway here is that because rulers mess up, true justice actually requires deep knowledge, reflection, and wisdom, not just brute strength or political dominance. Power without knowledge is just absolute chaos. And then we get this major theatrical beat in the text. Socrates twists the argument to show that the perfectly unjust man, the tyrant, is actually a fool who is completely deceiving himself. Thrasymachus is forced to realize he is defending a miserable, tyrannical existence. And for the first time, this tough guy actually blushes in shame. His whole realist persona is punctured. But even though he's silenced, our big question, what justice actually is, remains completely unresolved. This vacuum takes us to section 3, the famous ring of Gyges. Plato's own aristocratic brothers, Glaucon and Adeimantus, actually step up here because they aren't satisfied with Thrasymachus just being shamed into silence. Glaucon adapts this wild story about a man named Gyges who discovers a magic ring that grants total invisibility. With this ring, Gyges is completely immune to any consequences whatsoever. And what does he do? He sneaks into the palace, seduces the queen, murders the king, and seizes absolute power without ever getting caught. The crucial point here is this direct challenge to you. Seriously, if you could get away with absolutely anything, if you had that ring, what would you do? Would you still pay for your groceries? Would you still tell the truth? Glaucon is pushing Socrates into a corner, asking why anyone with absolute invisible power and total immunity would ever prefer to be just instead of just taking whatever they want. These guys challenge Socrates to prove that justice isn't just some sucker's game for the weak, but something a strong, independent person would choose purely for its own sake.
They're totally sick of hearing people say honesty is the best policy just because it brings a good reputation or rewards later on. They demand that Socrates strip away all the rewards, all the punishments, and definitively prove that justice inherently creates a state of self-control, autonomy, and true independence in a person's soul. To answer that incredibly tall order, we move to section 4, the city and the soul. Socrates pivots to a grand macro solution. He realizes that looking at the microscopic human soul is going to be way too difficult. It's like trying to read tiny, blurry letters from far away. So he proposes that we build a theoretical city in speech and use it as a massive magnifying glass. If we can understand how justice operates on the massive scale of a whole society, we can then shrink that model back down to understand the governance of the individual human mind. This right here is the central metaphor of the entire republic. To see how this builds, Socrates initially sketches out a very simple, peaceful city, focused only on basic necessities, food, shelter, survival. But Glaucon rejects this boring setup completely, calling it a city of pigs. He demands a feverish society full of luxuries, art, and intense competition. Socrates agrees, but he notes that a feverish, luxurious city will inevitably require expanding its territory, and that means one thing: fighting wars. This feverish city introduces the central psychological concept of this entire explainer, thumos, or spiritedness. Thumos is that wild, aggressive alpha energy that seeks honor, fame, and distinction. It's the drive to dominate others and be first in the race of life. It's the exact energy that builds massive empires, but, and here's the catch, it's also the exact same energy that can tear a society apart from the inside if it goes unchecked. And that naturally brings us to our final section, taming the feverish city. If our society is driven by this competitive fever, how do we take that intense drive for dominance and actually mold it so that these individuals protect the city instead of enslaving it? Socrates realizes that the survival of this new, just city relies entirely on figuring out how to domesticate this aggressive human nature. His wild, and honestly super controversial, solution is strict educational reform and censorship. He literally wants to ban the beloved Homeric epics, which were basically the Bible of the ancient Greek world. Why? Because the gods in these stories are petty and fickle, and heroes like Achilles are terrible role models who are greedy, cruel, and driven by blind anger. Socrates argues you simply cannot raise a disciplined, self-controlled citizen if their childhood stories celebrate chaotic, selfish behavior. He insists we must deprive storytellers of their power to enchant. He wants to expel the great poets and utilize education as a tool of military necessity to mold a tight cadre of young warriors. By installing Socratic philosophy and ruthlessly controlling exactly what music, art, and stories the youth are exposed to, he believes the city can forge a highly disciplined class of guardians who will value the common good over their own personal glory. But here is the crazy irony. This actually rehabilitates Polemarchus's old argument from the very beginning of our journey. Socrates states that these carefully educated warriors must act like noble watchdogs, gentle to their own people but fierce and hostile to strangers. It reveals that even in a utopian, philosophically perfect city, you still require a fierce loyalty to your own tribe just to survive in a dangerous, feverish world. So, we've built an entire city, created an elaborate education system, and literally censored art just to keep human nature in check. It's a profound thought experiment that brings us right back to the individual. Looking at all of this incredible effort to construct a just society leaves us to wonder about our own internal compass. Do we actually love justice for its own sake, or are we just terrified of what happens when the ring of invisibility comes off? Think about that the next time you find yourself entirely unobserved. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning everything.